March 15, 1962. Commissioner William Parker's hands trembled as he signed the document that would change everything. Not from fear, but from excitement. After 30 years in law enforcement, he was about to cross a line that would make him more money than his pension ever could. The document wasn't a police report or an arrest warrant. It was a partnership agreement. A deadly secret alliance between New York's most powerful crime boss and 6 of the city's most corrupt police commissioners. What happened next didn't just reshape organized crime in America, it rewrote the rules of power itself. The story begins 2 years earlier, in the winter of 1960, when Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, better known as Bumpy Johnson, realized something that would terrify every law enforcement agency in the country. The police weren't his enemies. They were his greatest potential asset. Bumpy had spent decades fighting the system, bribing individual cops, dodging raids, playing cat and mouse with federal agents. But that night, sitting in his Harlem apartment, counting the latest tribute money from his numbers operation, a thought struck him like lightning. What if instead of fighting the system, he became the system? The idea wasn't born from desperation. By 1960, Bumpy Johnson was already the undisputed king of Harlem. His empire stretched from 110th Street to 155th Street, encompassing everything from numbers running to loan sharking to protection rackets. He controlled more territory than some small countries, commanded more loyalty than most politicians, and generated more cash flow than legitimate businesses that employed thousands. But Bumpy was a visionary, and visionaries always think bigger. He didn't want to just run Harlem. He wanted to run the entire Northeast Corridor, and he knew that to do that, he needed something no crime boss in history had ever achieved. He needed the police to work for him, not against him. The first approach happened on a cold February night in 1960. Commissioner Michael Sullivan was leaving his favorite restaurant in Little Italy when a well-dressed black man approached him on the sidewalk. Sullivan's hand instinctively moved toward his service weapon until the man smiled and extended a business card. The card was simple, elegant, expensive. It read, "E.R. Johnson, Community Development Consultant." Sullivan almost laughed. Everyone in law enforcement knew who Bumpy Johnson was. What they didn't know was why he was standing on a public street, in the open, talking to a police commissioner like they were old friends discussing the weather. Bumpy's opening line would become legendary among the 6 commissioners who eventually joined his circle. He looked Sullivan dead in the eye and said, "Commissioner, you've spent 25 years trying to arrest people like me. How's that working out for you?" Sullivan started to respond with the standard law enforcement rhetoric about duty and justice, but Bumpy held up his hand. "Before you give me the speech, let me ask you something. How much money did you make last year? Real money. Not your salary. Money you could actually live on, retire on, leave to your children." Sullivan's silence was answer enough. That's when Bumpy laid out what he called the new mathematics. He pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it on the hood of Sullivan's car. Inside were photographs, financial records, surveillance reports, and detailed dossiers on every major crime family operating in New York. The Colombos, the Genoveses, the Gambinos, the Lucchese's, the Bananos. Bumpy had been watching them all, learning their operations, mapping their territories, calculating their earnings. What he showed Sullivan that night wasn't just intelligence. It was a complete business plan for taking over organized crime in America's most important city. The numbers were staggering. The 5 Italian families, combined, were generating approximately $47 million annually in illegal revenue. Numbers, bookmaking, loan sharking, labor racketeering, drug trafficking, extortion. $47 million flowing through New York every single year, and law enforcement was catching maybe 2% of it. Bumpy looked at Sullivan and asked the question that would change everything. What if instead of catching 2% of criminals, you helped catch 100% of profits? Sullivan tried to walk away, but Bumpy wasn't finished. He explained that the Italian families were vulnerable in ways law enforcement had never recognized. They were old, set in their ways, relying on traditions that made them predictable. They trusted blood over brains, loyalty over strategy, fear over respect. Most importantly, they were racist. They looked down on black criminals, considered them inferior, never saw them as serious threats. That blindness, Bumpy explained, was their fatal weakness. And it was his ultimate advantage. The proposition was simple in concept, revolutionary in execution. Bumpy would provide the police commissioners with detailed intelligence on Italian mob operations. Locations, times, participants, evidence, everything they needed to make high-profile arrests that would advance their careers and cripple his competition. In exchange, the commissioners would ensure that Bumpy's operations remained untouched. No raids, no surveillance, no investigations. His people would have immunity, his territory would be protected, and his business would grow without interference. But Bumpy wasn't just offering a quid pro quo arrangement. He was offering something far more valuable: partnership. The commissioners wouldn't just be protecting his crimes, they'd be profiting from them. 10% of all revenue from numbers operations. 15% of loan sharking profits. 5% of everything else. Clean money, laundered through legitimate businesses, deposited in offshore accounts, completely untraceable. Conservative estimates put each commissioner's annual take at over $200,000. In 1960 money, that was generational wealth. Sullivan left that meeting without giving Bumpy an answer, but he couldn't stop thinking about the proposition. $200,000 a year. His daughter could go to any college in the country. His wife could have the life she deserved. He could retire at 55 instead of 65, maybe buy that house upstate they talked about for years. All he had to do was look the other way while Bumpy Johnson eliminated the Italian mob's stranglehold on New York crime. When he really thought about it, wasn't that what good police work was supposed to accomplish anyway? 3 weeks later, Sullivan made his decision. He arranged a meeting with Bumpy at a small diner in Queens, far from anyone who might recognize either of them. That meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, Sullivan wasn't just agreeing to Bumpy's proposal, he was helping to refine it. As a career law enforcement officer, Sullivan understood things about police operations that even Bumpy's extensive intelligence network couldn't provide. He knew which judges could be trusted, which prosecutors were ambitious enough to be useful, which federal agents had gambling debts or drinking problems or expensive divorces. Sullivan didn't just become Bumpy's first police commissioner ally. He became his recruitment coordinator. The second commissioner was easier. James Crawford had been passed over for promotion 3 times, despite 22 years of exemplary service. He was bitter, disillusioned, and financially stressed. His son needed surgery that insurance wouldn't cover, his mortgage was underwater, and his pension wouldn't vest for another 8 years. When Sullivan approached Crawford with Bumpy's offer, the conversation lasted 15 minutes. Crawford's only question was when he could start. Commissioner number 3 was the most dangerous recruitment. Anthony Ricci was Italian-American, with family connections to legitimate businesses that sometimes dealt with questionable clients. Bumpy personally handled Ricci's recruitment because he understood that ethnic loyalty could override financial incentive. The approach was different. Instead of money first, Bumpy offered respect. He arranged for Ricci to be invited to exclusive social events in Harlem, introduced him to influential black businessmen and politicians, treated him like the respected law enforcement professional he genuinely was. Only after Ricci felt valued and appreciated did Bumpy mention the financial opportunities. Ricci's recruitment revealed something crucial about Bumpy's strategy. He wasn't just corrupting police commissioners. He was identifying men who felt undervalued by the system and giving them a place where their skills and experience were genuinely appreciated. Ricci brought something invaluable to the partnership: intimate knowledge of Italian-American criminal culture. He understood family hierarchies, recognized cultural signals, could predict how traditional mob bosses would react to pressure. With Ricci's insights, Bumpy's intelligence network became exponentially more effective. The 4th, 5th, and 6th commissioners came aboard within 6 months of each other, each recruited through carefully orchestrated approaches that targeted their specific vulnerabilities and desires. Commissioner David Lynch had always dreamed of running for mayor but lacked the financial backing. Commissioner Robert Hayes had a gambling problem that was spiraling out of control. Commissioner Frank Morrison simply recognized that Bumpy Johnson was going to win this war with or without police help, and he wanted to be on the winning side. By early 1962, Bumpy Johnson commanded something unprecedented in American criminal history, an alliance of 6 police commissioners representing different precincts, different specializations, and different access points into law enforcement operations across New York City. Through them, he had advance warning of every major police operation, complete intelligence on competitor activities, and the ability to direct law enforcement attention wherever it would most benefit his interests. The first major operation under this new alliance targeted the Colombo family's numbers operation in Brooklyn. Bumpy provided precise intelligence about a large-scale numbers processing facility operating out of a warehouse in Bensonhurst. Times, dates, participants, evidence locations, everything the police needed for a spectacular raid. The bust made headlines across the city. 43 arrests, over $2 million in cash and betting slips seized, completely dismantling what had been the Colombo's most profitable Brooklyn operation. What the newspapers didn't report was that within 72 hours of the raid, Bumpy's people had moved into the abandoned territory. The same bookmakers who had been working for the Colombos were now working for Bumpy, processing the same bets through the same networks, but sending profits to Harlem instead of Brooklyn. The police commissioners received their agreed-upon percentages from the new operation, making them financially invested in its success. The second operation was even more devastating. The Genovese family had been running a loan sharking operation that targeted small business owners in the garment district. High-interest loans, violent collection methods, businesses destroyed when owners couldn't pay. Commissioner Ricci provided Bumpy with detailed information about the operation's structure, while Commissioner Sullivan arranged for federal tax agents to investigate the money laundering aspects. The resulting investigation lasted 8 months and resulted in indictments against 37 Genovese associates, including 2 family captains. Again, Bumpy moved quickly to fill the vacuum. But instead of simply taking over the Genovese loan sharking operation, he revolutionized it. Lower interest rates, more reasonable payment terms, actual business consultation to help borrowers succeed rather than fail. Word spread quickly through the small business community that Bumpy Johnson's money was not only available, it came with genuine support for business success. Within a year, Bumpy's loan sharking operation was generating more revenue than the Genovese operation ever had, while creating genuine economic development in minority communities. The pattern repeated across all 5 Italian families. Intelligence from the commissioners led to targeted law enforcement actions that dismantled specific operations without touching the broader criminal infrastructure. Bumpy would then move into the abandoned territory with improved services, better community relationships, and more sustainable business practices. The police commissioners received their percentages, the communities benefited from reduced violence and exploitation, and Bumpy's empire grew exponentially. By 1963, the alliance had achieved something remarkable. Italian mob influence in New York had been reduced by an estimated 60%. Not through traditional law enforcement, which had been trying unsuccessfully for decades, but through strategic intelligence sharing between a black crime boss and corrupt police commissioners. The 5 families were still operating, but they'd been pushed into less profitable territories, forced to accept smaller market shares, and constantly looking over their shoulders for the next police raid. Meanwhile, Bumpy's organization had become the dominant criminal enterprise in the city. Conservative estimates put his annual revenue at over $15 million, with operations spanning from traditional numbers running to sophisticated white-collar crimes. He employed over 400 people directly, with thousands more dependent on his operations for their livelihoods. His loan sharking had helped launch hundreds of minority-owned businesses. His protection services had reduced violent crime in participating neighborhoods. His political contributions had helped elect city council members, state legislators, and even a congressman. The commissioners were living their dreams. Sullivan bought his house upstate and enrolled his daughter in Vassar. Crawford paid for his son's surgery and purchased a vacation home in Florida. Ricci launched a successful campaign for city council with Bumpy's financial backing. Lynch accumulated enough money and political connections to make a serious run for mayor. Hayes paid off his gambling debts and bought a small casino in Nevada. Morrison invested his proceeds in legitimate real estate development and became a millionaire. But success brought scrutiny. By late 1963, federal investigators were beginning to notice patterns. Too many successful raids on Italian mob operations. Too much detailed intelligence appearing in police reports. Too many minority criminals avoiding prosecution despite obvious criminal activity. FBI agent Robert Kennedy Jr. was assigned to investigate what the Bureau was calling unusual law enforcement effectiveness patterns in New York City organized crime investigations. Kennedy's investigation revealed something that terrified federal authorities. Not just corruption, which was unfortunately common, but organized corruption. A systematic alliance between criminal enterprises and law enforcement that was more sophisticated, more profitable, and more politically connected than anything in FBI files. Kennedy's preliminary report, classified at the highest levels, warned that Bumpy Johnson hadn't just corrupted 6 police commissioners. He'd created a template for taking over law enforcement that could be replicated in any major city in America. The federal response was swift and decisive. Instead of trying to prosecute the commissioners, which would have exposed the full extent of the alliance and potentially inspired copycat operations elsewhere, the FBI chose a different strategy. They would eliminate the alliance by eliminating its architect. On July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson suffered a heart attack while dining at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. He was 62 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest brought on by coronary artery disease. What the public never learned was that 2 weeks before his death, Bumpy had received a visit from 2 federal agents. The conversation lasted 30 minutes. No recordings exist, no notes were taken, no witnesses were present. But after that meeting, Bumpy told his closest associates that the game had changed, that the alliance with the commissioners was ending, and that he was considering retirement. His heart attack occurred 11 days later. The commissioners scattered quickly after Bumpy's death. Sullivan retired within 6 months and moved to his upstate house. Crawford transferred to a small department in upstate New York. Ricci left law enforcement entirely and focused on his political career. Lynch's mayoral campaign collapsed amid unrelated scandal. Hayes moved to Nevada permanently. Morrison continued with real estate development but never again involved himself with criminal enterprises. The alliance died with Bumpy Johnson, but its legacy lived on in ways that law enforcement still doesn't fully understand. The operational methods Bumpy developed for managing police relationships, the intelligence gathering techniques his organization perfected, the community integration strategies that made his criminal enterprise genuinely popular in Harlem, all of these innovations influenced organized crime for decades after his death. More importantly, the alliance proved something that authorities had never wanted to acknowledge. Under the right circumstances, with the right leadership, criminal organizations could become more effective at law enforcement than legitimate law enforcement agencies. Bumpy's alliance didn't just solve crimes, it prevented them. It didn't just prosecute criminals, it eliminated criminal competition. It didn't just protect communities, it improved them economically and socially. The forbidden alliance between Bumpy Johnson and 6 police commissioners lasted less than 8 years, but it changed organized crime in America forever. It demonstrated that the line between criminal and law enforcement isn't as clear as society wants to believe. It showed that corruption, when systematically organized, can be more effective than legitimate authority. Most dangerously, it proved that charismatic criminal leaders, given the right opportunities, can build organizations that rival government agencies in their effectiveness and exceed them in their community support. Today, law enforcement agencies across the country study the Bumpy Johnson alliance as a cautionary tale about the dangers of systematic corruption. FBI training materials include detailed case studies of how the alliance operated, how it was detected, and how similar operations might be identified and prevented. Police commissioners received specific training about the recruitment techniques Bumpy used and the warning signs that indicate systematic criminal infiltration of law enforcement. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Forbidden Alliance is this: Ellsworth Raymond Johnson didn't succeed because he was more ruthless than other criminals, or more violent, or more connected. He succeeded because he understood something that law enforcement agencies still struggle to accept. In communities where legitimate authority has failed, people will turn to illegitimate authority that delivers results. Bumpy's alliance with the police commissioners worked because it gave communities what they wanted: reduced crime, economic opportunity, and protection from exploitation. The deadly secret wasn't just that 6 police commissioners worked with a crime boss. The deadly secret was that their collaboration was more effective at fighting crime, improving communities, and generating prosperity than decades of legitimate law enforcement had ever been. That's the lesson law enforcement doesn't want to learn, the truth they don't want to acknowledge, and the reason why the story of Bumpy Johnson's Forbidden Alliance remains one of the most closely guarded secrets in American criminal justice history. The implications of this Forbidden Alliance extended far beyond Harlem's borders, creating ripple effects that would reshape American law enforcement for generations. What made Bumpy Johnson's partnership with corrupt commissioners so effective wasn't just their willingness to bend rules. It was their understanding of community dynamics that traditional policing had completely overlooked. Consider the economics of legitimate versus illegitimate authority. When police conducted traditional raids on numbers runners, they would arrest dozens of people, disrupt local businesses, and create economic chaos in neighborhoods that were already struggling. The arrested individuals would lose their jobs, families would lose breadwinners, and legitimate businesses would suffer from the collateral damage. But when Bumpy's organization regulated the same activities through his alliance with police commissioners, the economic impact was entirely different. Numbers running continued, but it was controlled, predictable, and generated revenue that stayed within the community rather than flowing to outside criminal organizations. The commissioners who worked with Bumpy weren't just taking bribes, they were participating in what amounted to an alternative governance system. They provided Bumpy with advance warning about federal investigations, but in return, Bumpy's organization maintained detailed records of criminal activities in Harlem that were more comprehensive than anything the police department had ever compiled. When a serious crime occurred, a murder, a rape, a kidnapping, Bumpy's network could identify perpetrators and witnesses within hours, something that traditional police work often took weeks or months to accomplish. This information sharing created a feedback loop that made both sides more effective. Police commissioners could show dramatic crime reduction statistics in their districts, while Bumpy could eliminate competitors and troublemakers who threatened the stability of his operations. The result was a form of community policing that actually worked, even though it violated every principle of legitimate law enforcement. The psychological impact on Harlem residents was profound. For decades, they had experienced police officers as an occupying force, agents of a hostile system who entered their neighborhoods to make arrests, collect evidence, and leave without making any meaningful contribution to community safety or prosperity. But the police who worked with Bumpy were different. They were invested in the neighborhood's success because their own success depended on it. They had financial incentives to reduce crime, to protect local businesses, and to maintain community stability. This created what sociologists would later recognize as stakeholder policing, a model where law enforcement officers have direct economic and professional stakes in the communities they serve. The corrupt commissioners working with Bumpy were essentially early practitioners of community-oriented policing, though they achieved community integration through criminal partnerships rather than legitimate community engagement programs. The most disturbing aspect of this alliance wasn't the corruption itself, it was how well it worked. Crime rates in Bumpy's territory were consistently lower than in adjacent neighborhoods that received traditional policing. Property values remained stable even during periods of urban decline. Local businesses thrived under the protection of an organization that had both the incentive and the power to maintain order. Young people in the community had access to economic opportunities, even if those opportunities existed within an illegal framework. Federal investigators who eventually uncovered pieces of this alliance struggled to explain its effectiveness to their superiors. How do you write a report explaining that a criminal organization provided better community services than legitimate government agencies? How do you document that collaboration between crime bosses and corrupt police produced superior outcomes to traditional law enforcement? The cognitive dissonance was so severe that many investigators simply focused on the technical violations rather than examining the broader implications of what they had discovered. The alliance also revealed the limitations of legitimate reform efforts. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, various police reform initiatives attempted to reduce crime in Harlem through increased patrols, community outreach programs, and improved training for officers. These efforts consistently failed to match the crime reduction achieved through Bumpy's illegal partnerships. Reform-minded police commissioners who refused to work with criminal organizations found themselves presiding over higher crime rates, greater community unrest, and more economic instability than their corrupt predecessors had experienced. This created a perverse incentive structure within the police department. Honest cops who followed proper procedures were often transferred out of successful districts, while officers willing to work within Bumpy's system were rewarded with promotions, better assignments, and the satisfaction of actually reducing crime in their communities. Over time, this selection pressure created a culture where the most effective police officers were often the most corrupt ones. The financial mechanics of the alliance were equally complex. Bumpy's organization didn't just pay bribes, they created an entire shadow economy that provided services the legitimate government couldn't or wouldn't provide. They funded neighborhood improvement projects, provided low-interest loans to local businesses, offered employment opportunities to residents who couldn't find legitimate work, and maintained an informal welfare system for families facing economic hardship. The police commissioners who participated in this system weren't just accepting payments. They were collaborating in the operation of an alternative municipal government. When federal authorities finally began serious investigations into police corruption in Harlem, they discovered financial records that read like the budget of a small city. Bumpy's organization was collecting revenue, distributing services, maintaining infrastructure, and providing public safety on a scale that rivaled legitimate municipal operations. The corrupt police commissioners were essentially serving as the law enforcement arm of this shadow government, using their legitimate authority to protect and enable an illegitimate but highly effective governance system. The investigation files reveal that Bumpy understood the fundamental weakness of American law enforcement, its disconnection from the communities it was supposed to serve. Traditional policing treated communities as adversaries to be controlled rather than partners to be served. But Bumpy's alliance with police commissioners created a model where law enforcement officers were accountable to the community in immediate, tangible ways. If crime went up, if businesses were threatened, if residents felt unsafe, the financial and professional consequences for participating officers were immediate and severe. This accountability mechanism was more responsive than any civilian review board or internal affairs investigation. Police commissioners working with Bumpy knew that their effectiveness would be measured not by bureaucratic metrics or political considerations, but by actual community outcomes. Their compensation, their reputation, and their continued participation in lucrative partnerships depended on their ability to deliver real results to real people in the neighborhoods where they worked. The tragic irony is that this criminal alliance achieved many of the goals that legitimate police reform movements had been pursuing for decades. It created community accountability, economic investment in underserved neighborhoods, responsive law enforcement, and sustainable crime reduction. But because it was built on illegal foundations, these achievements could never be acknowledged, studied, or replicated through legitimate means. Today, as police departments across America struggle with community relations, accountability, and effectiveness, the lessons of Bumpy Johnson's forbidden alliance remain buried in classified files and sealed court records. The deadly secret isn't just that it happened, it's that it worked better than anything that came before or after. The parallels between this underground system and modern policing challenges become even more striking when examined through specific case studies that emerge from declassified documents decades later. In 1965, A routine drug bust in Brooklyn accidentally exposed the depth of similar arrangements operating throughout New York's outer boroughs. Detective Anthony Marcelli, working what he believed was a standard narcotics investigation, stumbled upon financial records showing regular payments flowing from known crime figures to police precincts across 3 districts. What Marcelli discovered wasn't simple corruption, it was systematic community management that had created the lowest crime rates in those neighborhoods' recorded history. Elderly residents could walk safely at night, local businesses thrived without constant theft, and violent crime had virtually disappeared from areas that had previously been considered war zones. The criminal organizations weren't just paying for police cooperation, they were funding a parallel social services network that addressed the root causes of street-level disorder. These arrangements had evolved far beyond Johnson's original Harlem model. In Queens, a gambling syndicate had partnered with local precincts to create what amounted to an unofficial community mediation service. Domestic disputes, neighborhood conflicts, and minor criminal matters were resolved through a hybrid system that combined traditional police intervention with community-based arbitration overseen by crime family representatives who actually lived in these neighborhoods and had genuine stakes in their stability. The effectiveness of this system created an uncomfortable truth that law enforcement officials struggled to address even decades later. When federal investigations finally dismantled these networks in the early 1970s, crime rates in the affected areas increased by an average of 47% within 18 months. Community trust in legitimate law enforcement, which had never been particularly strong, plummeted to historic lows. The neighborhoods that had experienced unprecedented safety and stability under the illegal partnerships descended into chaos that took years to address through conventional policing methods. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that several federal law enforcement agencies had been aware of these arrangements for years but had chosen not to intervene because the results were so demonstrably positive for community welfare. Internal memos from the FBI's New York field office, released through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1990s, revealed ongoing debates about whether dismantling these networks would actually serve the public interest. This moral ambiguity extended throughout the law enforcement hierarchy, creating a crisis of institutional conscience that reverberates through American policing to this day.